In today's Psychology of a Killer episode, we are going to be talking about who these killers are and what their traits are. So, I wanted to start off this entire series with some base knowledge and definitions. First of all, what is a serial killer? Well, the official FBI definition of a serial killer is 3 separate events in 3 or more separate locations with an emotional cooling off period between homicides. This is different than a mass murder where someone kills multiple people all at one time. So with that out of the way, let's go over the general characteristics of a serial killer. These are taken from a small group of some of the most infamous serial killers and are not necessarily blanket statements for all serial killers, but here are some more generalized things that many of them have in common. So these types of people tend to have a higher IQ than normal, but despite their intelligence, they tend to do poorly in school. They can't hold a job, and they usually end up in unskilled professions. Most of them come from troubled backgrounds, with one or more parents either abandoning, abusing, or neglecting them. They typically have long histories of psychiatric problems and criminal records, and many of them have family history of alcohol and drug abuse. Because of their childhoods of being abandoned and abused, often by their fathers, they tend to have a distaste for male authority figures. Because their mothers are often the ones who had power over them growing up, they often also have sort of hostility towards females. A lot of times we see them manifesting their psychological problems as children, and they often spend a lot of time in isolation and juvenile institutes. So due to the amount of time that they spend in isolation as children, they often have a general hatred of the world and can be suicidal as teenagers. Then, as teenagers and young adults, they become obsessed with things like voyeurism, fetishism, violent pornography, and have sexual deviant behaviors. But again, these are just very generalized characteristics from some of the most prolific serial killers that we know. These behaviors can be found in people who are not killers, who've never harmed anyone in their life, and some killers don't exhibit some of these characteristics. It's just a generalization. So now that we know some of the more general characteristics, let's look into the 3 main early warning signs. Again, I'm going to keep reiterating this, but these signs do not guarantee that a person will grow up to be a killer, but these signs were present in a lot of the killers that we know today. Researchers have identified the 3 main warning signs as the following. Bedwetting. As we know, many young children will wet the bed, and it's absolutely no big deal. However, as a child grows into puberty, if they're still wetting the bed, that can be a sign of significant emotional disturbance. According to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, about 60% of all sex murderers were wetting the bed as adolescents. The next warning sign is starting fires. Many serial killers begin their destructive behaviors at a very young age. There have been killers known to start setting vacant houses on fire as young as 6 years old. Others have started fires at schools or even stores. Of course, these destructive behaviors are manifestations of deep-rooted anger and aggression. And then lastly, of course, the one that most of us know very well is animal torture. We hear about this one all the time as an early warning sign for serial killers. As juveniles, children's aggression is aimed at hurting small animals and life forms that are thought of as less than humans. We have heard about killers doing unspeakable things to animals as young as 10 years old. So now that we know some of the traits and warning signs for serial killers, let's get deeper into the psychology and what kind of leads them to these behaviors. Many serial killers have one very interesting thing in common. They are diagnosed with a personality disorder called antisocial personality disorder. So what is antisocial personality disorder? It sounds a little bit different than what it actually is. A lot of people hear this disorder and think, it's just someone who's antisocial, who doesn't like talking to people, who maybe sits by themselves at lunch. But what it really is just a complete disregard for society's rules. This disorder is characterized by the following factors. So people with this disorder generally have a disregard for morals, for social norms, and the rights and emotions of others. These people take pleasure in exploitation of others in harmful ways for their own gain, or like I said, pleasure. They also have this way of manipulating or deceiving others using a superficial charm. They may make themselves look very innocent or even to have a disability or pretend to be working for some admirable cause. They have a lack of empathy for others and experience a lack of guilt or remorse about harming others. They can either exhibit or they hide feelings of hostility, irritation, aggravation, aggression, or violence. Along with all of this, they lack a fear of dangerous situations, and their behaviors often lead them to very risk-taking behaviors. Then, after taking these risks and facing consequences, they fail to learn from the consequences of their actions and just keep doing them. People with antisocial personality disorder have a history of unstable relationships, including romantic relationships, friendships, and relationships with their parents. A lot of the time, they fail to fulfill work and school and financial obligations. And lastly, they have reoccurrent fallouts with authority figures, including law enforcement, which can lead them to being arrested and convicted. Again, not to sound like a broken record, and I'm probably going to keep repeating this, but having this disorder is not the end-all be-all for making a serial killer. Of course, there are so many people with ASPD who never go on to hurt anyone. There are killers who never had this disorder at all. But it's important to mention because having this disorder, it's no wonder that some people go on to do the things that they do. So like I just said, not everyone with ASPD goes on to kill anyone. So then we have to ask ourselves, how do some of the people with this disorder end up killing people or having such sadistic behaviors? We also know that not every child with an abusive parent or abusive background ends up as a serial killer. Only a very, very small percentage do. So now I want to look into the physiological and anatomical differences that may contribute to these behaviors. So first of all, studies show that serial killers have extremely high levels of testosterone in compared to the average man. Testosterone is that manly hormone that is responsible for a man's increased ability to gain muscle, and it's also responsible for their anger and violence in general as compared to women. Women have less testosterone, so we tend to be less angry and aggressive than men. That's just how it is. Obviously, though, most men have levels of testosterone that don't cause unreasonable aggression and violence. One thing I do want to point out to here is we always hear about those people taking anabolic steroids, which is basically just jacking up your testosterone levels to incredibly high amounts so that you can gain muscle and improve your athletic performance. We know that one of the main side effects of anabolic steroids is anger and aggression, so people with naturally incredibly high levels, it makes sense that they would exhibit these behaviors. Dopamine can be another contributing factor. Dopamine is that nice brain chemical that is responsible for happiness and motivation. However, those with low levels of dopamine need greater excitement to feel stimulated or motivated in comparison to people with normal levels. So having this concoction of anger and aggression as well as lower levels of the happy chemical along with needing a higher level of stimulus to feel excited, it makes for someone who will go to extreme lengths to feel good. As we know, a lot of killers will start off with one victim with a very long cooling off period, but then as time goes on, they have more victims with very short cooling off periods. They need more stimulation to feel the same high that they were once getting before. So these brain chemicals, as well as a general imbalance of brain chemistry, can be huge contributing factors. But the fact of the matter is, these factors coming together in perfect sync to create a killer is just slim to none. And then you have to ask, what about those who don't have these chemical imbalances? What about those who do have the chemical imbalances but never go on to kill anyone? And what about other contributing factors? So one interesting thing about the brain is that it is capable of desensitizing. Think about how a cognitive behavioral therapist treats phobias. They use exposure therapy. So what is exposure therapy? Exposure therapy is exactly what it sounds like. It's exposing the individual to the stimuli that they are unreasonably terrified until their arousal levels reach a low enough level that they're completely desensitized by the stimulus. Of course, the first few times that the person is exposed to these stimuli, it's uncomfortable and it's terrifying and it's really not a good experience, but after experiencing it over and over and over again, it doesn't bother them as much anymore. This same effect can happen to pretty much anyone, whether you're in therapy or not, whether it be good or bad. Let's think of, for example, an emergency room nurse. Chances are, if you're a normal person who works as, let's say, a teacher, the sight of an open, bloody, gushing wound will cause some fear and disgust and anxiety. Compare that to a 40-year-old emergency room nurse who has just been exposed to the absolute worst things for the past 15 or 20 years. Chopped off body limb can just be another day at the office. So that just kind of shows that in order for someone to be capable of being a killer, they need a pretty perfect mix of physiological reactions or lack thereof and desensitization. Someone who is used to seeing their father beat their mother, someone who has been severely beaten themselves, someone who started killing animals, someone who witnessed a horrible tragedy. Things that would shock and upset most people become no big deals to others. We think back to killers getting in trouble for being violent and starting fires and hurting animals when they're children. By the time they're adults, it's no big deal. They need more to feel that same high while at the same time being completely desensitized to these other things over time. So now that we kind of have the physiological reactions and desensitization out of the way, let's talk about the brain structure and brain anatomy. But before we get into the brain structure of a killer, let's get into the brain structure of normal newborn babies. So as we said before, there's a number of different environmental and physiological factors that can contribute to the making of a killer, and there's no one factor that trumps them all. Genes play a huge role in how our brains develop, but so does our environment. Our brains need the proper stimulation to develop correctly. It doesn't matter if you're a baby genius. It doesn't matter if you are born with a mental disability. If you're not getting the proper stimulation and attention as an infant, your brain does not get the chance to grow and make connections properly. From the time that we are born, our brain starts making about 2 million synapses per second until the time that we are toddlers. These synapses are basically just different brain paths and connections that our brain uses to store information and learn. But as we grow, our brains do not need every connection that our brains had made. If we kept every single bit of information in our heads from the time that we were born and for the rest of our lives, our brains would be simply overloaded. These synapses are either kept or discarded based on our experiences as a child in a process called pruning. By the time you reach adolescence, about half of your synapses have been discarded, and the amount that you have in your adolescence is basically the same amount that you have for the rest of your life. Our brains are extremely capable of adapting to our environments. They are constantly developing and changing, which scientists refer to as plasticity. So as you can tell, the proper care and attention is needed for the development of the growing mind. So as you might be able to tell from what I just told you, if you're a toddler and you're growing up into your adolescence and you're not getting any stimulation or any knowledge or any information in your brain, these synapses are just going to be discarded because you don't need them. So a child who's not getting any attention or getting all the wrong attention won't develop properly in their brain. So what exactly happens if a child is neglected in these vital stages, and how can they turn a completely normal brain into the brain of a killer? Let's find out. There are so many different areas of our brain that are responsible for so many different functions. I am going to briefly go over some of the most prominent ones. Your prefrontal cortex is responsible for behavior, cognition, and emotional regulation. Children who are severely neglected as children indicate that they have a smaller prefrontal cortex. There are also studies that show children who have been physically abused may have smaller orbitofrontal cortex, which is responsible for emotional and social regulation. Next, we're going to be talking about your amygdala. Although most studies have found that amygdala volume is not affected by maltreatment, abuse and neglect can cause overactivity in that area of the brain, which helps determine whether a stimulus is threatening and triggers an emotional response. So why is this important? Well, many studies have shown that psychopaths have underdeveloped brains, specifically in their orbital cortex. However, I'm going to pause here, and before I get into the science of this all, we're going to review some of the patterns of behaviors observed with serial serial killers. This will help us make connections as to why they think the way they do in connection to some of their brain activity. Serial killers generally have a cycle during which they kill. They most often kill during periods of stress, and then after killing, they typically feel relieved from this pressure to kill. And again, most serial killers have experienced childhood traumas and abuse as children. A neuroscientist named James Fallon found a connection between some of these behaviors and linked them to one specific area of the brain: the orbital cortex. Again, the orbital cortex is involved with ethical behavior, moral decision-making, and impulse control. The orbital cortex also helps you control your amygdala. The amygdala, again, is involved in aggression and triggering an emotional response. He found in brain scans that serial killers have less activity in the orbital cortex and more activity in the amygdala. So, what does this mean? Well, if the orbital cortex is underactive, meaning there is a lack of moral decision making, its lack of activity means that it doesn't help control the amygdala, then there is a mixture between this lack of moral and ethical thinking and an increased emotional response, such as anger and aggression. To put it all together in a simple statement, these brains do not do a great job of controlling anger and moral decision making. In his research, he also found genetic links that may play a role in the mind of a killer. The gene called, excuse me if I pronounce this wrong, monoamine oxidase A, aka MAOA, is a gene that regulates serotonin in the brain. He believes that this gene will not respond to the calming effects of serotonin.
Key thing is that the major violence genes is called the MAOA gene, and it has to do with too much serotonin during development. It's kind of interesting because serotonin is supposed to make you calm and relaxed, but if you have this gene in utero, your brain is bathed in this, so your whole brain becomes insensitive to serotonin, so it doesn't work, later on. And so if you have that gene and you see a lot of violence in a certain situation, this is the recipe for disaster.
Now, the crazy thing about the studies that James Fallon did is that he used the brain scans of psychopaths, himself and his son. He found that his son had normal orbital cortex activity, but he actually had orbital cortex activity that resembled that of a serial killer. So, what does this lead him to believe? He came to the conclusion that there are 3 ingredients to creating a psychopath: genetic makeup, brain activity, and childhood abuse and trauma. Fallon's brain on the right has dark patches in the orbital cortex, the area just behind the eyes. This is the area that Fallon and other scientists say is involved with ethical behavior, moral decision-making, and impulse control. The normal scan on the left is his son's. So what does this all mean? We know that there are certain areas of the brain associated with behaviors that are common in serial killers. Basically, we need the perfect mixture of brain chemistry, physiology, and childhood trauma and brain anatomy to create a killer. In no way am I saying that these are absolute, but it does give us a better understanding of the minds of these despicable human beings. So that is all the information that I put together for this episode. I used research studies, I used books, and I used articles from the internet. I do want to say that this is not all of the information. There is so much information, but I don't want to turn this into an hour-long lecture or anything like that. I wanted to put together the most relevant and digestible information that I could. If you are interested in more of the brain anatomy and physiology, I highly suggest looking into it yourself because it is very interesting. I could probably go on for a very long time about this, but again, I wanted to put together the most easily understandable and digestible information possible without overloading you too much with information. In the next episode, we are going to be discussing the types of killers and what drives each killer to do what they do. Episode number 2 is coming out tomorrow, so make sure you turn on the notifications so you don't miss it.